At the edge of a desert road in northern Mexico, there is a place where the wind never stops moving the dust. Travelers say the dust carries whispers, names, questions, and the sound of engines that once roared through the night. Locals learned long ago not to follow the tire marks that disappear into the mesquite. They lead nowhere, and everywhere. They lead to the past, and to the pieces of people no one ever found. Before sunrise on a cold morning in Sinaloa, a farmer reported a single abandoned truck beside a dry riverbed. The doors were open. The headlights were still on. Inside the cab, the engine was warm, but the driver was gone. And around the truck, scattered across the sand, investigators counted 40 sets of footprints, some large, some small, some belonging to people who clearly ran barefoot through the dark. The trail zigzagged into the brush and then vanished, as if the desert itself swallowed them whole. Hours later, as the first police unit approached the scene, a call went out over a radio frequency that wasn't supposed to exist. "Leave it. Walk away." 2 words, spoken calmly, with the certainty of someone who knew the law would obey. Because for decades, in this region, orders didn't always come from police chiefs or commanders. They came from men who moved in shadows, men who built an empire out of the mountains and the coastline, men whose names echo in courtrooms and morgues, in corridos and whispers, in the nightmares of people who lived through the worst of it. This is the world the Sinaloa Cartel shaped, an empire born from fishing villages, raised through violence, protected by corruption, and enforced by fear. An empire that rewrote the map of Mexico with blood. Some of the earliest survivors tell stories that sound impossible: convoys appearing without headlights, entire villages silenced overnight, a single phone call that could freeze an entire town. A journalist once said that covering the cartel felt like reporting on an earthquake while standing on the fault line. One wrong step, and the ground opened beneath you. In a city many miles away, a schoolteacher recalled the night she heard automatic gunfire cut through the quiet. She shielded her children under a table, listening as the shots moved closer, then stopped. When she opened her door at dawn, the street was empty, except for a message painted across a wall. "This city belongs to us now." Across the border, agents intercepted coded radio traffic, voices discussing routes, shipments, betrayals. One recording captured a man laughing softly as he spoke about a rival who would not see another sunrise. The transcript listed the moment of silence that followed, 5 seconds. Long enough for everyone listening to understand what came next. And yet, behind the violence lay a structure, a hierarchy, a logic, cold, calculated, relentless. This was not chaos. It was control. In the late 2000s, after a series of arrests, raids, and political shifts, many believed the organization would collapse. But instead, it adapted. Routes changed. Leaders shifted. Alliances broke and reformed. Entire territories were traded like currency. The cartel moved through history the way a river cuts through rock, slow, patient, unstoppable. Investigators found ledgers, names, payments, towns, shipments, and codes marking those who had crossed a line. Many of the coded entries matched real people who vanished without explanation: journalists, local officials, even teenagers who were simply at the wrong place on the wrong night. For families searching for answers, those ledgers became the closest thing to a grave. One mother spent 10 years searching for her son. 10 years walking through makeshift mass grave sites with a photograph pressed to her chest. She once said, "I don't want revenge. I only want to bring him home." 10 years, and she never found him. In border cities, residents learned the rhythm of danger, the sudden quiet, the roaring engines, the distant bursts of gunfire. They lived in the shadow of an organization powerful enough to negotiate with governments, disciplined enough to outmaneuver armies, and ruthless enough to eliminate anyone who threatened its business. But behind the headlines, behind the arrests and dramatic escapes, behind the myths and the fear, lies a story far more complicated, and far more human. A story of men who rose from poverty and built an empire that spanned continents. A story of communities caught between loyalty and terror. A story of corruption so deep it blurred the line between criminal and official. A story of blood spilled over deserts, mountains, farmlands, and city streets. And at the heart of it all, power. Pure, unfiltered power. Power that reshaped a nation. Tonight, we trace that power from its quiet beginnings to its darkest moments. We follow the routes carved through mountains and coastlines. We meet the people who lived under the weight of an empire. We explore the betrayals, the alliances, the escapes, the wars. We read the ledgers. We hear the voices. We uncover the patterns that have haunted Mexico for more than 3 decades. Because once you understand how an empire like this was built, you begin to understand why it never truly falls. And there is one moment, one event, that changed everything. A moment buried under fear, sealed in silence, and spoken of only in the quietest corners. It is the key to understanding what came next. It is the reason this story matters. And when we reach it, you will see how every name, every body, every decision led to one unavoidable point. But before we can uncover that moment, we must return to where it all began, long before the convoys, long before the wars, long before the world learned the name that would echo across continents. To a coastline. To a handful of routes. To a series of choices that would ignite one of the most powerful criminal organizations the world has ever known. This is how the story of bodies, power, and blood truly begins. Before the world learned the name Sinaloa Cartel, before the newspapers, before the international manhunts, before the wars that reshaped entire states, there were fishermen. Quiet men who woke before sunrise, pushed rickety boats into the Pacific, and knew the ocean the way a priest knows scripture, every current, every rocky inlet, every place where you could land without being seen. These coasts were remote. Beautiful, but unguarded. A place where the government's reach felt distant, and where entire communities lived by grit and improvisation. In the 1970s and early 1980s, poverty was the tide that never receded, and survival meant being resourceful, or being forgotten. At first, the cargo was simple. Cigarettes. Alcohol. Small things smuggled in from passing ships, anything that could be sold for enough pesos to buy food for a week. But the Pacific is a wide ocean, and boats from Colombia, Panama, and South America learned something important. Sinaloa's coastline was perfect. Too perfect. No radar. No fences. No serious patrols. Just endless coves and fishermen who asked few questions. It began quietly, with bundles wrapped in burlap tossed overboard at night, marked by faint lights drifting on the waves. Fishermen collected them the way they collected nets. They didn't ask what was inside. They didn't want to know. They delivered the bundles to a man waiting on shore, someone with connections, someone who paid better than the markets and never renegotiated. Those early routes were small, modest, but they were the first arteries of something far larger. One of the men involved in these trades remembered the early days in a court testimony decades later. He said, "We didn't think of it as crime. It was just business. Boats came in, money came out. But business has a way of growing. And money has a way of calling dangerous men." As the years passed, more boats arrived. The bundles became larger. The payments came faster. And with the money came new actors, men who understood logistics, who built relationships with Colombian suppliers, who recognized the potential of remote mountain communities where law enforcement rarely ventured. The Sierra Madre Mountains, towering, rugged, ancient, became both refuge and fortress. Narrow trails wound between villages hidden in the highlands. These mountains shielded families for generations, and soon, they would shield something else. By the late 1980s, small-time operations had transformed into a coordinated network. Routes emerged: coastal, aerial, overland. Airstrips were carved out of farmland. Pilots flew in low, dropped packages in remote areas, and disappeared before anyone could track them. And in the mountains, small processing labs, rudimentary at first, sprang up like scattered embers. The heat, the isolation, the loyalty of the communities, it was a perfect combination. Authority was flexible in those regions. A payment to a local official could ensure silence. A favor to a mayor could guarantee a blind eye. The lines between law and crime blurred until they were nearly invisible. Yet even then, what would become the Sinaloa Cartel was not a single organization. It was a constellation of alliances, loose, unpredictable, held together by money, necessity, and shared enemies. Figures like Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Rafael Caro Quintero, names that would later appear in headlines, were already experimenting with large-scale distribution. They pioneered a model that reshaped trafficking in the Americas. But as their influence grew, so did tension. Territory meant money. Money meant control. And control, in this world, always draws blood. One former local policeman, interviewed in the 1990s, described the escalation like this. First it was quiet. Then men showed up with radios. Then pickups. Then rifles. Little by little, everyone knew who really ran the mountains. The fishermen, the original carriers, became couriers. Couriers became lieutenants. Lieutenants became regional bosses. Each step upward brought power and danger. And above them all, a new hierarchy began taking shape. A structure that revolved around trusted alliances, family ties, and a ruthlessly efficient understanding of business. An organization that learned from every conflict, every arrest, every betrayal. An organization that would survive the collapse of the old guard and rise as its own empire. But before we can understand the rise, we must understand the environment that made it possible. Sinaloa was not just a place, it was a landscape perfectly engineered for secrecy. Mountains that swallowed sound. Beaches that welcomed midnight landings. Roads that twisted into darkness. Towns where everyone knew everyone, and everyone kept quiet. And then came the moment that changed everything. Pressure from the U.S. tightened, Colombia shifted strategies, and the old network, the Guadalajara Cartel, began to fracture from within. Arrests shook its foundation. Leaders were scattered. A vacuum opened. Vacuum is dangerous in this world. Someone will fill it. The only question was who. In the shadows of collapsing alliances, in the aftermath of violent reprisals and desperate reorganizations, a new power center emerged in the mountains and coastlines of Sinaloa, more agile, more disciplined, more connected, and far more ambitious. What began as scattered operations was about to consolidate into something unprecedented. Something that would define an era. Something that would spread from villages to cities to entire nations. The world didn't know it yet. But the Sinaloa Cartel was taking shape. And the first true turning point. The moment that transformed a loose network into a machine. Was about to arrive. Because with the fall of the old hierarchy came a question whispered across the mountains. Who controls the routes now? The answer is where the real story begins. The answer is where the real story begins. When the old hierarchy collapsed, the mountain routes didn't vanish. The airstrips didn't disappear. The coastline didn't forget the rhythm of midnight landings. What vanished was certainty. And in uncertainty, new power brokers emerged, men who understood that strength wasn't just measured in bullets or muscle, but in connections, trust, and the ability to move product across continents without ever being seen. These brokers were not soldiers. Not enforcers. They were strategists, quiet, calculating, and patient. They knew the terrain, the families, the debts, the history of every small village tied to the trade. They learned which commanders could be bought, which governors would look the other way, and which pilots could fly blind through cloud cover at midnight. When the Guadalajara cartel fractured, these men didn't fight for the throne immediately. They did something far more dangerous. They began building alliances that could outlive any war. In those years, the mountains buzzed with rumors. Someone was negotiating directly with Colombian suppliers. Someone was securing routes through Baja California. Someone was meeting with local leaders, promising stability in a world suddenly without it. Someone was stitching the remnants of an empire into a new shape. And for the first time, people spoke of a structure that didn't rely on a single leader, but a network of brokers who needed each other to survive. One investigator later described them as the architects, the men who built the framework of what would become one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the hemisphere. They moved in silence. They traveled light. They met in ranches, safe houses, roadside cafes, and mountainside cabins where the air grew thin and secrets felt safe. These men understood something essential. Control the plazas, and you control the movement. Control the movement, and you control the money. Control the money, and everything else falls into place. In coastal towns, fishermen noticed new faces at the docks, men who didn't dress like laborers and didn't speak like locals, but who paid generously for services nobody admitted to providing. Farmers saw convoys pass through their villages without stopping. Small-town mayors suddenly had access to budgets they never had before. Not because the government sent money, but because the brokers needed peace. Peace was profitable. Violence was expensive. But peace in this world is an illusion. It lasts only as long as no one challenges it. One night, during a private meeting in the mountains, reported years later in court documents, a broker told a group of regional operators, "We don't need chaos. We need discipline. We need routes that run like veins." Veins. A simple word, but a perfect metaphor. Because traffickers had always viewed the country like a body, arteries leading north, capillaries branching through the desert, a heart beating in the mountains. Yet as their influence grew, so did their enemies. Rival factions, splinters of the old guard, refused to surrender their plazas. Old loyalties clashed with new ambitions. Corrupt officials who once served the Guadalajara structure were suddenly up for grabs. And in the shadows, old grudges resurfaced like buried embers waiting for a spark. That spark came in the form of betrayal. A shipment vanished. A pilot disappeared. A trusted lieutenant found himself ambushed on a lonely highway. At first, no one knew who was responsible. Whispers blamed a rival group. Others blamed foreign traffickers. But the brokers interpreted the signs differently. Someone was testing them. Someone wanted to see whether this emerging network was strong enough to survive a strike. Their response was subtle but decisive. They didn't send armies. They sent messages, quiet, calculated warnings to those who considered challenging the new order. Within weeks, the attack stopped. The message had been received. But the brokers understood something deeper. If they wanted to endure, they couldn't remain shadows forever. They needed structure, leadership, consistency. They needed to transform a collection of alliances into a unified force. In the same mountains that once sheltered small-time smuggling operations, key figures gathered, figures who understood risk, politics, logistics, and the delicate balance between violence and negotiation. They drafted agreements. They divided responsibilities. They protected routes that were worth fortunes. They set rules, harsh, unforgiving rules, for those within their circle and those outside it. They weren't just building a cartel. They were building a system. And as this system solidified, people across the region began to feel the shift. Police checkpoints started receiving quiet instructions. Local businesses prospered under unofficial protection. Drug corridors that once changed hands every month suddenly stabilized. Suppliers realized they could negotiate with one organization instead of many. The brokers had brought order to the chaos. But order always comes with a cost. And soon, that cost would be paid in blood. Because even as the network strengthened, a rival force was forming, more aggressive, more reckless, and eager to claim the same routes. And as tensions rose, the first major internal conflict of this new era approached like a storm creeping over the mountains. For now, the brokers held the reins. But the question whispered across Sinaloa grew louder with each passing month. Who will rise above the rest? Because in this world, alliances are fragile. Ambition is corrosive. And the men who built an empire together were destined to collide. The stage was set. The routes were secured. The money was flowing. The power was shifting. And the world was about to learn the name of the man and the organization that would define the next generation of violence. What happened next changed the map of Mexico forever. What happened next changed the map of Mexico forever. Because when power begins to crystallize, when routes solidify, when alliances settle into shape, the next force that enters the story is the oldest one of all. Money. Not the small bundles once traded on dusty docks. Not the half-payments passed beneath tables in roadside cantinas. But torrents of cash, untraceable, unstoppable, flowing faster than anyone could count. Money became the bloodstream of the emerging empire. And like blood, it coursed everywhere, into businesses, into ranches, into the pockets of officials, into the hands of men who once struggled to buy a day's worth of food. Suddenly, modest houses were renovated. Desert towns saw new hotels. Agricultural companies expanded overnight. Nightclubs sprouted in places no tourist had any reason to visit. Airstrips that looked abandoned on aircraft control systems lit up at midnight like private highways. And behind every sudden boom, there was a silent question. Where's all this money coming from? People knew the answer, but no one said it aloud. Across the Pacific coast and deep into the interior, laundering networks took shape, built through real estate, construction companies, cattle ranching, bars, and even small bakeries. Some businesses operated at a loss intentionally, others thrived beyond imagination. It didn't matter. Their purpose wasn't profit, it was transformation. Dirty money went in. Clean money came out. The empire grew. And with money came influence. Officials who once refused to cooperate suddenly changed their tone. Permits were signed faster. Investigations stalled. Checkpoints looked the other way. Resources disappeared. Reports went unfinished. Files were misplaced. A former federal agent, speaking anonymously years later, described it simply. The organization didn't need to corrupt the entire system. Only the right few. The right few were everything. Commanders. Customs officers. Police chiefs. Municipal leaders. One well-placed official could open a corridor more valuable than gold. But corruption was only one pillar of their expansion. The second pillar was investment. The brokers understood the importance of legitimacy. They built networks of legitimate businesses that gave them cover, transportation channels, storage facilities, and excuses for financial movement. They invested in farms, fish processing plants, shipping companies, auto dealerships, trucking fleets, operations that looked ordinary from the outside but formed the logistical skeleton of an empire. A businessman from Culiacan once said, "Money changes a man. But power changes a city." And power was rearranging cities piece by piece. In border towns, property values shifted dramatically as certain neighborhoods became safe zones, territory watched over by men who were never officially listed on payrolls, but who enforced stability with iron discipline. Businesses thrived in these zones, not because crime vanished, but because violence was selective, controlled, governed. People worked. People lived. People stayed silent. Because silence was the price of peace. And yet, beneath that peace, tension simmered. Rival factions, smaller, more aggressive, less disciplined, tried to chip away at the brokers' influence. They wanted a share of the routes, a piece of the gold rushing north. And they were willing to use chaos to get it. So the brokers adapted. Quiet influence turned into strategic force. Payments turned into ultimatums. Warnings turned into retribution. But raw violence was only used when absolutely necessary. The real power was financial. By the early 2000s, the organization structure had become a hybrid of old-world discipline and modern business intelligence. They monitored shipments with precision. They tracked payments like an accounting firm. They used couriers with clean backgrounds and handlers with reliable networks. They diversified, different routes, different products, different contingencies. And they poured money into political campaigns, community projects, and social structures to maintain local loyalty. In one small town, families received monthly stipends delivered in envelopes. In another, new roads were paved even though the government had no record of approving them. In yet another, schools received supplies no one could trace. People knew where it came from. But in regions where the state's presence was faint, the organization filled the void. Some called it manipulation. Others called it survival. One mother explained it plainly to a reporter. "The government never came here. They did." But with every peso invested, every official compromised, every corridor secured, one truth grew impossible to ignore. This was no longer a loose alliance. It was an empire, disciplined, wealthy, and deeply embedded. And empires attract enemies. Rival cartels, weakened but not destroyed, eyed the growing influence with fury. Foreign agencies intensified surveillance. Governments on both sides of the border began shifting policy, deploying troops, launching operations. Pressure mounted. But pressure has a way of forging steel. The brokers refined their strategies. They anticipated moves before they happened. They negotiated when they could. And acted decisively when they couldn't. Money gave them reach. Corruption gave them protection. Intelligence gave them foresight. Fear gave them silence. And ambition gave them momentum. But something else was rising, something more volatile, more aggressive, and more unpredictable. A rival group, leaner, hungrier, and determined to seize control of the North, was preparing for confrontation. Soon, money would no longer be enough. What followed would shake entire states and drag civilians into a storm they never asked to face. Because the empire might have been built on money. But it would be defended with blood. And as the brokers tightened their grip, the first signs of a looming war were already appearing on the horizon. The peace they crafted was ending. The conflict that followed would change everything. The peace they crafted was ending. And the conflict that followed would change everything. But before the first shots echoed across cities, before the headlines, before the firestorms that seized entire highways, the organization turned its attention to the lifeblood of its empire, the corridors. Because in this world, routes are power. Whoever controls the corridors controls the flow. And whoever controls the flow, controls everything. Across deserts, mountains, and borders, these corridors, once simple footpaths and coastal drop points, had evolved into an intricate web of land, sea, and air routes. Each one was a vein feeding an empire of money and influence. And those veins needed to remain open. No matter what. In the 1990s and early 2000s, couriers were the quiet heroes of the trade, unseen, uncelebrated, but essential. They weren't soldiers. They weren't commanders. Many were ordinary men and women who had never held a weapon in their lives. What they carried was not power, but risk. Some drove battered pickup trucks loaded with hidden compartments welded beneath the floorboards. Some walked through dry riverbeds with backpacks strapped tight across their shoulders. Some piloted small aircraft, flying low beneath radar, engines throbbing through the night as they skimmed mountain ridges. Others simply carried suitcases across border checkpoints, blending into crowds with the precision of ghosts. One courier, later arrested and interviewed by investigators, described his routine. "You don't breathe when you drive. You don't look at the police. You don't look at mirrors. You stare at the road and pretend you're invisible." For many, the paycheck was irresistible. For some, it was desperation. And for others, it was coercion. Because once a courier accepted a job, willingly or unwillingly, the corridor owned them. These corridors stretched across the nation like a hidden map no government ever fully understood. In the West, coastal routes connected fishing villages to staging points. In the North, highways and ranch roads carved through the desert. Deep underground, tunnels, some crude, some astonishingly sophisticated, snaked beneath the border, reinforced with wood beams, electric lights, ventilation systems, even rail tracks. One such tunnel discovered in the early 2000s shocked authorities. Nearly half a mile long. Meticulously engineered. Impossible to build without skilled labor and serious funding. A subterranean artery designed to move products silently beneath one of the most heavily watched borders in the world. But tunnels were only one piece of the puzzle. Aircraft routes evolved just as quickly. Small Cessnas flew in under cover of darkness, their lights off, pilots trained to navigate by stars and instinct. They landed on improvised airstrips hidden between fields of tomatoes and corn, strips that would be plowed under by morning, erased like footprints in sand. And when air routes became risky, the organization adapted again. Boats slipped across the Gulf and the Pacific. Shipping containers concealed shipments behind legitimate cargo. Trailers carried goods through multiple states without ever being checked. Every corridor had its own rhythm. Its own dangers. Its own guardians. And they were guarded fiercely. Because rivals wanted them. Government forces hunted them. Foreign agencies monitored them from the sky. Every mile of road became a contested line. Every checkpoint became a gamble. Every courier became a witness to the vast, invisible machinery of a growing empire. But the corridors were more than logistics. They were symbols, territory, control, presence. A corridor claimed was a statement. A corridor lost was a wound. And in those years, the organization began to face challenges it couldn't ignore. A competitor, growing bold and aggressive, launched strikes along several routes, ambushing convoys, intercepting shipments, even targeting couriers who had nothing to do with rivalries. These strikes were not random. They were probing attacks, a test of strength, a declaration of intent. The message was clear. We want the corridors. But the brokers did not yield. Instead, they fortified. They placed lookouts, halcones, on hills, rooftops, bus stops, street corners. Teenagers with radios. Old men pretending to sell fruit. Taxi drivers, shop owners, fishermen. Eyes everywhere. Ears everywhere. Nothing moved without being noticed. Nothing entered or left without a whisper traveling up the chain. In some regions, the organization built entire communication networks, encrypted radios, relay stations, coded language. A hidden telecommunications web that often operated more efficiently than official systems. And when necessary, they struck back. Convoys appeared without warning, armored trucks rolling through dirt roads like thunder. Safe houses were emptied in hours. Rival lookouts vanished. And the corridors, threatened by competitors, were reclaimed with precision. One former municipal officer later recalled a night when a convoy passed through his town without stopping. No gunfire. No shouting. They just moved through like a tide. And in the morning, 3 roads that were closed became open again. Everyone understood. These were not random acts. This was strategic warfare. But while the organization reinforced its corridors, something else was happening, something far more dangerous. Government pressure was increasing. New laws. Joint operations. More checkpoints. More raids. More surveillance. Every attempt to close a corridor forced the organization to innovate. Every new restriction pushed them deeper underground, literally and figuratively. But despite the pressure, the corridors endured. Because the brokers understood a truth that officials often ignored. Land can be controlled. Roads can be blocked. But human desperation, corruption, and geography can't be erased. Throughout the early 2000s, the corridors grew more efficient, more complex, and far more essential. They became the arteries of a kingdom, the pathways through which money, influence, and violence flowed freely. And as they strengthened their grip on these vital routes, the organization crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Because the rivals who sought to seize the corridors did not give up. They regrouped. They rearmed. They built alliances of their own. And soon, the corridors would become battlegrounds, the spark that ignited a war that swallowed entire cities and left thousands caught in the crossfire. The storm was coming. And the first winds were already howling across the deserts. The storm was coming. And the first winds were already howling across the deserts. Because in this world, territory is everything. A corridor is only as strong as the land it crosses, the towns it passes through, the people who guard it, and the fear that keeps challengers at bay. And when a rival force rises, hungry, reckless, impatient, the land becomes a battlefield long before the first shot is fired. By the mid-2000s, tension stretched across northern Mexico like a wire pulled tight, humming with violence. 2 visions of power collided, one built on discipline and structure, the other built on intimidation, brute force, and rapid expansion. Each wanted the same thing: the routes, the corridors, the cities that controlled the gateways north. The conflict didn't start with gunshots. It started with whispers. Truckers warned of unfamiliar checkpoints. Villagers saw convoys passing at dusk where there had never been convoys before. Lookouts reported strangers quietly entering towns, renting safe houses, watching the roads. In remote mountain passes, men wearing mismatched uniforms asked for taxes that no one had ever heard of. Something was coming. Something large. Something violent. And then, the first killings began. They were targeted, precise, almost surgical. A lieutenant ambushed on a mountain road. A trusted courier found in an irrigation canal, radio still clipped to his shirt. A community leader who had once negotiated safe passage suddenly vanished after attending a family gathering. Each death was a message. Each message was a warning. And each warning meant the rival force was no longer probing the organization's defenses, they were claiming ground. The organization responded in kind. Rival safe houses burned. Convoys were intercepted. Suspected collaborators disappeared. Roads that had once echoed with the sound of commerce became corridors of fear. Entire towns felt the shift. A shopkeeper in Sonora later told investigators, "One day the price of tortillas changed. Not because of flour. Because the men who controlled the town changed." Territory is never merely land. It's access. It's intelligence. It's revenue. It's control of the people who live there, whether through trust, coercion, or sheer terror. And both sides wanted it. Desperately. The first major flashpoint erupted along a series of border-adjacent highways, arteries that fed billions into the illicit economy. Control of these roads meant dominance of the frontier. Losing them meant losing power, losing leverage, losing the ability to influence governments and negotiate survival. A convoy from the rival faction moved boldly across one of these highways one night, 20 vehicles deep, armored, loaded with men carrying automatic weapons. They rolled through the dark like a column of steel and intent. They didn't hide. They wanted to be seen. Hours later, the response came. A counter-convoy appeared, silent at first, then roaring across the desert roads with engines that sounded like thunder tearing the night apart. Lookouts screamed warnings into radios. Towns locked their doors. Street dogs fled into the brush. And somewhere between those two moving storms, the first large clash ignited. Gunfire erupted, long, punishing bursts that echoed off canyons and rolled across the plains. Tracers stitched the darkness. One vehicle flipped and burned. Another rammed into a ditch. For more than 20 minutes, the night lit up like a battlefield in a war no one had officially declared. This was no longer a quiet competition. This was war. And war spreads. Within months, firefights erupted in cities that had once known peace. Ambushes appeared on highways that had once carried produce and tourists. People learned to distinguish gunfire not by fear but by caliber. Entire neighborhoods painted over graffiti every morning, new tags marking new owners, new threats, new rules. Local police, overwhelmed and outgunned, often retreated in the face of conflict. Officials resigned en masse. Some towns disbanded their police forces entirely. The vacuum grew. And wherever there is a vacuum, violence moves in. Families fled their homes with nothing but a bag of clothes and the fear that staying meant death. Schools closed. Businesses shuttered. Roads that once connected communities now separated them. Children learned to sleep through distant bursts of automatic fire the way children in other countries learned to sleep through thunderstorms. One teenager, years later, said, "We didn't play hide and seek. We played where's the safest corner of the house." Border cities suffer the most. Control shifted back and forth like a tide of blood and uncertainty. Some nights, the streets were deserted except for stray dogs and armored trucks with blacked-out windows. Other nights, explosions shook buildings as rival factions battled for control of warehouses, bridges, or key intersections. The organization adapted. They fortified positions. They deployed enforcers with military training. They recruited specialists, men who knew explosives, men who knew surveillance, men who knew how to intercept communications. This was a new era. An era where a cartel no longer acted like a criminal group, but a paramilitary force. And yet, even as the violence intensified, the organization's leadership remained focused. They understood something essential. Territory isn't won by killing alone. It's won by outlasting your enemy. They leveraged their financial power, their logistics, their alliances. They paid communities for cooperation. They protected some neighborhoods fiercely while others suffered unimaginable violence. They negotiated with local actors, sometimes with threats, sometimes with money, sometimes with a combination of both. Meanwhile, the rival faction doubled down. Their methods were brutal, their ambition limitless, their desire to dominate the northern trade corridors absolute. They wanted cities, whole cities. They wanted ports. They wanted access to the heart of the organization's empire. Territorial warfare escalated into kidnappings, forced disappearances, mass graves, tragic markers of a conflict spiraling out of control. Search groups led by mothers and volunteers combed fields, abandoned lots, and dry riverbeds, searching for loved ones with nothing but shovels, candles, and photographs held against their chests. The human cost mounted. But the land stayed contested. Every square mile mattered. Every town, every checkpoint, every warehouse was a pawn in a deadly game where the prize was not land but dominance of an entire underground economy. And then, as the war reached a fever pitch, something shifted. A major border city, one of the most contested, one of the most violent, one of the most strategically vital, became the epicenter of the conflict. Rival forces pushed in with overwhelming aggression, determined to claim it. The organization responded with equal force, matching strength for strength, bullet for bullet. For months, the city shook under the weight of the war. Helicopters circled overhead. Armored vehicles patrolled streets. Gun battles erupted in broad daylight. Children were caught on their way to school. Workers were caught on their buses. Families hid in bathrooms as bullets tore through walls. And then, after countless lives lost, after block by block was contested, after the city's heart had been carved open by violence, the organization regained the upper hand. Not because they were the most brutal. Not because they had the most guns. But because they understood the territory more intimately than their rivals ever could. They knew the back roads. The blind alleys. The way the city breathed. Where its pulse beat strongest. And when they struck with precision, cutting off supply lines, isolating rival commanders, reclaiming key intersections, and reimposing the silent order that had once kept the peace. But peace, once broken, never returns whole. The war left scars, on people, on cities, on the land itself. And even though the organization emerged stronger, more unified, more dominant, the cost was staggering. Entire communities were uprooted. Thousands vanished. The corridors, once thriving with commerce and quiet movement, now carried ghosts. And yet, amid all the destruction, amid the smoke and blood, amid the shattered families and vanished names, the organization saw something else forming. A new threat. A new enemy. A new kind of violence that made even veterans of the war uneasy. Because while they fought to retain control of the land, another faction, far more ruthless, far more militarized, far more unpredictable, was rising in the east. And soon, the next chapter of this empire would be written not with bullets, but with betrayals. And soon, the next chapter of this empire would be written not with bullets, but with betrayals. Because once the guns quieted, once smoke drifted away from burning streets, once the organization reclaimed the land it nearly lost, something undeniable remained in the air. Paranoia. War changes people. But internal war destroys them. The organization had survived one of the bloodiest territorial conflicts of the era. They had proven their dominance. They had reinforced their corridors. They had shown the world that their structure was more disciplined, more resilient, more deeply rooted than any rival imagined. But victory comes with a cost. Power concentrates. And when power concentrates, ambition grows like a fire beneath the floorboards, unseen at first, but spreading silently, relentlessly, until the wood begins to crack. Inside the organization, cracks had already begun to form. It started quietly. A commander failed to report the location of a shipment. A lieutenant refused to share revenue from a protected corridor. A long-trusted ally suddenly stopped answering radio calls. Rumors spread through the mountains that certain safe houses were now off-limits, guarded by men who did not report to the usual chain of command. The leadership sensed it. Something was shifting beneath their feet. The rival faction might have been beaten back. But a new rival was emerging from within. A new generation, raised in the age of extreme violence, familiar with paramilitary tactics, hungry for rapid expansion, began to challenge the old model. These younger figures did not want to negotiate. They did not want to maintain balance. They wanted dominance, loudly and quickly. They wanted to claim everything their predecessors had spent decades building, without inheriting the discipline or caution that kept the organization alive through multiple eras of conflict. And so, alliances that once felt indestructible became fragile threads stretched across mistrust. One regional operator, once a respected figure with deep ties to older leadership, began forming a splinter network, small at first, but fiercely loyal. He attracted ambitious soldiers, aggressive commanders, and younger recruits unconcerned with the old ways. Their methods were brutal. Their moves were unpredictable. They respected no boundaries, no long-standing pacts, no carefully negotiated understandings with other factions. To them, caution was weakness. And weakness was death. Their ascent triggered unease across the organization. Veteran figures, men who had lived through the worst of the territorial wars, saw danger in the rising tide. They recognized the pattern: unchecked ambition leading to internal fracture leading to internal war, and internal war, in this world, is always the most devastating war of all. But the young faction didn't care. They didn't care about diplomacy. They didn't care about stability. They didn't care that their recklessness threatened carefully maintained alliances with powerful groups across the country. They wanted to seize control now. Not in 10 years. Not when the older generation stepped aside. Now. And they would burn through anyone who stood in their way. The first open sign of fracture appeared in a rural region where two commanders, once allies, arrived at the same ranch to collect payment from a local producer. Each claimed authority. Each accused the other of encroachment. Tension escalated. Guns were drawn. Shots followed. The rancher's fence line was left littered with shell casings. And the men sent to exert control over the land ended up bleeding into its soil. News traveled fast. Too fast. Within days, the leadership convened urgent meetings. Not with fanfare. Not with public displays. But quietly, behind closed doors, where tempers flared and voices rose. The old guard demanded discipline. The young faction demanded recognition. One demanded order. The other demanded power. Neither side was willing to give ground. And then, the betrayals began. A warehouse, once used to store shipments, was raided, not by the government, but by men wearing the organization's own insignia. Millions in product vanished. Vehicles disappeared. Radio frequencies went dark. A lieutenant loyal to the old guard survived an assassination attempt after his vehicle was attacked outside a small border town. He later told investigators, "It wasn't rivals. It was us. It was our own." The leadership was stunned. The fractures were no longer cracks. They were canyons. The young faction entrenched themselves in strongholds, towns where they controlled communication, movement, and loyalty through intimidation and lavish payouts. They recruited enforcers who had no memory of the old days, men who respected only money and violence. Their influence spread like wildfire. The old guard responded in kind, securing mountain routes, recalling veteran fighters, reinforcing safe houses, and quietly eliminating potential turncoats. Years of alliances with local communities became their anchor. These communities knew the older leaders, trusted them, and offered information on the movements of the younger faction. But even with this advantage, the situation was spiraling. Because internal war is unpredictable. Every betrayal multiplies. Every rumor becomes a threat. Every silence feels like a gun being cocked just out of sight. Entire regions became divided, some loyal to the old leadership, others seduced by the young faction's promises of rapid expansion and higher pay. Towns once unified under a single authority now lived in confusion. People whispered at night, "Who controls us now?" And in some areas, the answer changed every week. Government forces, sensing the fracture, moved in. Raids intensified. Checkpoints multiplied. Dozens of arrests followed. From the outside, it looked like progress. From the inside, it poured gasoline onto an already raging fire. The young faction blamed the old guard for tipping off authorities. The old guard blamed the young faction for attracting unnecessary heat. Paranoia sharpened into hatred. One night, a meeting intended to negotiate a ceasefire ended in catastrophe. Gunmen loyal to the young faction opened fire before anyone could speak. 2 respected figures fell. The last bridge between the two sides burned to ash. The organization split. Not officially. Not publicly. But in practice. The fractures were now undeniable. The old guard consolidated in their strongholds, mountain-safe zones, loyal towns, long-established corridors. The young faction spread like wildfire across urban regions, using shock and awe tactics to assert dominance. Caught between them were civilians, families who had already survived territorial wars, who had endured rival invasions, and who now found themselves trapped in a conflict between two sides of the same empire. Entire regions lived in terror. Some nights, gunfights erupted not between rivals, but between men who had once shared meals, weapons, and trust. Betrayal seeped into every layer of the structure. Informants sold information to the side they feared least. Couriers switched allegiances to survive. Communities divided along invisible lines. Old friendships shattered under the weight of suspicion. And yet, deep within this chaos, a new kind of leadership began to emerge. The young faction, emboldened by rapid gains, proclaimed themselves the future of the organization. They believed the old guard was outdated, too cautious, too slow. But they underestimated something crucial. Experience. The veterans had survived decades of conflict because they understood the rhythms of power, when to strike, when to retreat, when to negotiate, and when to wait. And while the young faction fought loudly and visibly, the old guard fought intelligently, mapping out every betrayal, tracking every defection, building alliances with outside groups who viewed the new generation as reckless liabilities. The stage was set for a confrontation far deadlier than any feud with rivals. Because the worst wars are not fought between enemies. They're fought between brothers. And this internal war, born from ambition, fueled by mistrust, and accelerated by betrayal, was about to ignite across cities, mountains, and corridors. A war within the empire itself. A war so devastating it would reshape the organization's future. And carve a new chapter of violence across the nation. And in the midst of this looming conflict, one question echoed across every whispered conversation, every intercepted call, every terrified community. Who will survive the war inside the war? Who will survive the war inside the war? That question lingered across mountains, cities, safe houses, border crossings, and every place where whispers traveled faster than truth. But as the internal fracture deepened, something else began to shift, quietly at first, then violently, like a fault line giving way beneath an entire nation. Because wars born in the mountains don't stay in the mountains. Wars born in shadows don't stay in shadows. Eventually, they spill into the cities. And when they do, the world changes forever. The internal conflict, old guard versus young faction, didn't remain a hidden struggle for long. Its shockwaves radiated outward, colliding with rival groups, government forces, and communities already stretched thin by years of bloodshed. It was no longer just a battle for power. It was a battle for legitimacy, survival, and dominance in an environment where every decision carried a death toll. Cities that had once served as quiet transit hubs suddenly became battlegrounds. Corridors that once moved silently through back roads were now contested in broad daylight. And neighborhoods far from the mountains felt the tremors of a war they never asked to be part of. At first, the violence was sporadic, isolated clashes, sudden disappearances, small groups of armed men slipping through alleyways with hurried purpose. But then, the tempo changed. Gunfights erupted on avenues lined with restaurants and schools. Convoys of masked men sped through intersections, firing into the air to announce their presence. Businesses closed early. People began sleeping on their floors, away from windows. Hospitals prepared for nights when ambulances would be too afraid to move. Cities that had once been vibrant, centers of commerce, culture, families, and history, woke to a new reality. They were now pieces on a chessboard controlled by factions with nothing left to lose. One border city, once busy with shoppers, commuters, and tourists, felt the transformation like a cold front moving in at dusk. Overnight, entire districts became no-go zones. Taxi drivers refused to enter certain streets. School buses rerouted. Police patrols thinned out, then vanished completely from some neighborhoods. A shop owner recalled, "In the morning we swept the sidewalk. At night we listened to gunfire and waited for it to pass." The conflict escalated with a new level of brutality. The younger faction, armed with military-grade weapons and emboldened by their aggressive expansion, launched shocking displays of force, blockades, kidnappings, and targeted attacks meant to send a message. "We are here now." They commandeered vehicles at intersections, set them ablaze, and abandoned them as flaming barricades. They shut down entire highways, trapping hundreds of drivers who sat trembling behind steering wheels, afraid to move, afraid to get out, afraid to make eye contact with the masked men circling their cars. Residents learned to check social media at dawn, not for gossip or entertainment, but for warnings. Which streets were unsafe? Which neighborhoods had erupted overnight? Which sound meant to hide? Which sound meant to run? And through it all, the old guard held its ground, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with steady, methodical force. They knew the cities. They knew the political landscapes. They understood which blocks were worth defending and which were better abandoned temporarily. Their experience became their shield. Their discipline became their lifeline. But even discipline has limits. The rival factions struck at their financial hubs, their trusted bankers, their warehouses, their associates. This wasn't a battle fought in distant hills, it was fought in populated centers where every bullet risked hitting a child, a vendor, a nurse driving home from a night shift. One night, as darkness settled over a major city, a coordinated attack unfolded unlike anything residents had seen before. Explosions shook the ground. Gunfire rattled windows. Electricity flickered. Sirens wailed, then abruptly cut off. Families huddled in hallways, praying the violence wouldn't reach their street. When dawn arrived, the damage was clear. Buildings scarred with bullet holes. Burned vehicles scattered like skeletons. Dozens wounded. Several dead. And a message painted on a wall in black letters dripping down cement. This is just the beginning. But the city wasn't the only battleground. Ports, critical for international shipment routes, became targets. Airstrips turned into arenas of sudden ambushes. Border crossings experienced surges of intimidation. Entire convoys vanished on their way to deserts where no footprint survives the wind. The government, seeing the conflict escalate to dangerous levels, deployed federal forces. Marines patrolled boulevards. Armored vehicles rolled through public squares. Helicopters circled overhead, searchlights piercing the night. Checkpoints multiplied. Raids intensified. On the surface, it looked like a crackdown. But to those who lived in the crossfire, it felt like pressure from all sides, factions fighting factions, government fighting factions, civilians trapped between all of them. A schoolteacher in a border city described the dread of attending class. We taught the alphabet while hearing gunfire outside. Imagine trying to keep children calm when the walls shake. The younger faction responded to government pressure with defiance. They escalated, targeting officers, ambushing patrols, making clear that they would not retreat quietly. Their recklessness drew attention not just from national forces but from international agencies observing this spiraling violence with growing alarm. Meanwhile, the old guard took a different approach. They dug deeper into alliances, political, financial, and territorial. They relied on relationships built over decades. They negotiated where possible. They struck only when necessary, conserving resources for decisive moments. The internal war became a test of strategy versus aggression. But aggression has a terrible side effect. It spreads like a virus. The younger faction's unpredictable tactics destabilized entire regions. Cities that had avoided the worst of past conflicts now found themselves under siege. Municipal buildings were attacked. Journalists were threatened or silenced. Business owners were extorted or forced to close. The psychological toll was immense. Parents learned to identify gunfire by its rhythm. Children learned to drop to the floor without being told. Entire communities adopted survival routines, routes to avoid, times to stay inside, signals that meant danger. And as civilians suffered, the internal war reached its next stage: mercenaries. Both sides, desperate to outmaneuver the other, recruited specialists, former soldiers, foreign fighters, men with training meant for battlefields, not streets lined with families. This militarization changed everything. Gunfights became coordinated operations. Ambushes became tactical maneuvers. Explosives appeared more frequently. Drones began scanning neighborhoods. Safe houses transformed into command centers. Cities turned into war zones. And yet, for all the noise, all the terror, all the strategic brilliance and catastrophic miscalculations, one truth remained. The war was nowhere near finished. It was only evolving. Because as the younger faction continued its reckless advance, as the old guard fought to maintain structure, as government forces cracked down harder and harder, a new kind of pressure formed, one that neither faction could ignore. A pressure that came not from rivals, but from the corridors themselves. Cities can be destroyed. Territory can be contested. But the corridors, the routes that feed the empire, must remain open. And the internal war was choking them. Shipments delayed. Couriers frightened. Allies questioning their loyalties. Money disrupted. The empire's veins were constricting. And in this world, when the veins constrict, the heart begins to fail. The leaders knew it. The rival factions felt it. Communities sensed it. Government agencies recognized it. The internal war was reaching a breaking point. A point where one side would have to fall. Or both sides would lose everything. And as the walls closed in, as pressure mounted from every direction, a single decision was made, one that would ignite the most violent chapter yet. A decision born from fear. Born from desperation. Born from ambition. A decision that would unleash something the nation would never forget. That decision, born from fear, from desperation, from ambition, would unleash something the nation would never forget. Because when a war becomes too large, too chaotic, too costly, someone always turns to the one force that can change the balance of power in a single stroke. Information. And information, in the underworld, is collected by men and women who walk in darkness with two faces, one for the organization they serve, and one for the authorities hunting it. The undercover operatives. Their task is simple in theory, impossible in practice. Earn trust among people who trust no one. Watch men who see danger in every shadow. Carry secrets that could cost them their lives. And survive long enough to tell the truth. When the internal war reached its boiling point, government agencies sensed an opportunity. Tension between the young faction and the old guard created openings, small fractures through which light might enter. The goal wasn't merely to arrest individuals. It was to dismantle an empire from the inside, starting with intelligence. So the hunt began. Quietly. Patiently. Methodically. Agents in Mexico and the United States formed task forces, combined resources, and shared intelligence. Some worked in offices lit by buzzing fluorescent lights, staring at intercepted messages, piecing together networks, tracking shipments, analyzing patterns. Others worked in the field, driving unmarked cars through desert highways, meeting informants in dimly lit bars, following convoys at a distance with hearts pounding in their throats. But the most dangerous of them all were the undercover operatives who slipped into the organization itself, sometimes as drivers, sometimes as mechanics, sometimes as low-level couriers, and sometimes as the quiet man in the corner of a restaurant, pretending not to listen. Their stories rarely reach the public. Some are sealed in court documents. Others remain untold, buried behind redactions and classified files. But the pattern is known, the danger well documented. They walked into a world built on suspicion, and tried to blend in. One operative, interviewed after leaving the field, described his first night inside. It feels like jumping into a river at night. You don't know how deep it is. You don't know what's under you. You're just praying the current doesn't pull you under. His cover was simple. A mechanic. Quiet. Reliable. Invisible enough to avoid attention but useful enough to stay employed. He learned quickly that nothing in the organization happened without someone watching. Every movement. Every conversation. every unexplained moment of silence. One mistake could cost him his life. But the intelligence he gathered became invaluable. Routes, schedules, names, safe houses, the structure of the young faction, the vulnerabilities of the old guard. All of it flowed outward, across encrypted lines, into the hands of investigators who felt, for the first time in years, that they had a map of the invisible. But undercover operatives weren't the only source of information. Informants, people already inside the organization, began appearing in unexpected ways. Some approached authorities willingly. Some were arrested and offered deals. Some were coerced. Some turned because the internal war made them fear their own allies more than their enemies. A young courier, captured after a botched operation, confessed within hours. Not out of guilt, but out of terror. He told investigators, "I can't go back. They think I talked even when I didn't. If you send me back there, I'm dead before sunset." His information led to raids. The raids led to seizures. The seizures placed pressure on specific commanders. Pressure created fear. Fear created more informants. A chain reaction. But information flows both ways. Just as law enforcement sought to infiltrate the organization infiltrated law enforcement. Corrupt officers leaked operations. Officials sold intelligence. Some undercover operatives were compromised before they even began. One task force discovered that a ranking official, someone they trusted, had been feeding details to the young faction for months, leading to the deaths of several potential informants. The double betrayal shattered morale. In the organization, both factions understood exactly what was happening. They knew authorities were closing in. They knew undercover operatives were among them. They knew the walls were tightening. So they adapted. They changed routes daily. Signals shifted hourly. Meetings were rescheduled at the last second. Phones were used only once. Vehicles were abandoned after a single trip. Couriers were moved in rotating cycles, never allowed to remain in one region long enough to become familiar. Suspicion became a way of life. At safe houses, men would sit by windows all night, watching the street for unfamiliar cars. Conversations moved under running water to mask microphones. Trusted associates suddenly faced interrogations that felt more like death sentences. The internal war, already burning, now fused with paranoia and counterintelligence. Everyone suspected everyone. Everyone watched everyone. Everyone feared the mole who could be standing beside them. And then, the inevitable happened. A high-level operative, someone who had spent years navigating the organization's deepest circles, was exposed. The details remain guarded, but the broad outline is known. A slip of language. A mismatched detail. A piece of information he shouldn't have known. A call made too quickly. One of the factions, likely the younger one, identified him as a threat. He vanished. No body was found. Only a message, delivered to a government liaison in an anonymous envelope. "We know what you're doing." It was a chilling reminder that infiltration cuts both ways. After his disappearance, agencies doubled security. They reassigned personnel. They sealed communication channels. But the damage was done. Fear seeped into every corner of the investigation. Some operatives were pulled out. Others refused to continue. Every meeting carried risk. Every informant became suspect. Yet, despite the chaos, the intelligence continued to flow. Because for every operative lost, another survived. For every informant compromised, another stepped forward, some out of desperation, some out of revenge, some out of a desire for survival that outweighed loyalty. One of the most significant breakthroughs came from a series of intercepted communications, radio chatter from a mountain region known for housing key members of the Old Guard. The messages were coded, layered with slang, encrypted with techniques learned through years of trial and error. But analysts noticed patterns. Repeated phrases. Ritualized greetings. A sequence of numbers. When decoded, the transmissions revealed the location of a safe camp where dozens of the organization's most trusted operators were regrouping in the midst of the internal conflict. It was the opportunity investigators had waited for. An operation was planned, joint forces, coordinated at the highest levels, supported by tactical units trained for rapid raids. Helicopters were prepared. Ground teams were briefed. Undercover operatives provided final details, guard rotations, escape routes, terrain features. On a humid night near the mountains, the operation launched. Helicopters roared low over the ridges. Black-clad units deployed in synchronized waves. Ground teams advanced through brush and stone. The camp was surrounded before anyone inside sensed the danger. The raid was swift. Explosions tore through the compound. Shots rang out in the dark. Some fled into the mountains. Some died. Some were captured, men whose names had appeared on intelligence boards for years, men believed untouchable. It was one of the most significant operations in that region in decades. But the success carried a dark side. Because the younger faction saw the raid not as a victory for law enforcement, but as proof that the old guard had been compromised. They believed the older leaders had been betrayed by their own allies, or worse, by their own families. Paranoia detonated like a bomb. Retaliations followed, swift, merciless, and public. Trusted figures were eliminated. Informants, real or suspected, vanished. And the old guard, wounded but not destroyed, retaliated in kind. The internal war accelerated. The hunt became bloodier. The intelligence battle became more complex. Every step forward came with 3 new threats behind it. Undercover operatives continued their work, watching, listening, risking everything. Informants fed details through trembling hands. Analysts worked around the clock. But even as progress continued, a terrible realization began to emerge. The internal war had reached a point where neither side could win. And yet neither side could afford to lose. The pressure was unsustainable. The risk catastrophic. The consequences unimaginable. And as the conflict reached its peak, the organization's next move would send shockwaves through cities already on the brink. A move driven not by ambition, not by strategy, not by greed, but by sheer desperation. A decision that would ignite violence on a scale the country had not yet seen, and plunge entire communities into terror. A decision that would ignite violence on a scale the country had not yet seen, and plunge entire communities into terror. But before the detonations, before the roadblocks, before the convoys and the smoke, something else surfaced, something quieter, something older, something far more revealing than any raid or intelligence file. A ledger. Not the kind kept by banks. Not the kind that balances profits and losses. But a ledger of lives, of debts owed, loyalties kept, alliances broken, and people marked not by fate, but by a pen held in a steady hand. Because behind the chaos of the internal war, behind the gunfights, betrayals, and midnight raids, lay the quiet machinery of control. A system so organized, so meticulous, so deeply rooted in fear and obligation, that even battles could not erase it. Investigators called them notebooks, logs, accounting books. But those who lived under their shadow called them something else. The list. And this list, this ledger, was the true engine of the empire. Long before governments issued arrest warrants, long before reporters wrote stories, long before territories changed hands, the organization kept its own records, handwritten, coded, updated daily, sometimes hourly. Not just numbers. Names. Names of couriers who completed routes. Names of officials who accepted payments. Names of politicians who promised favors. Names of rivals to be eliminated. Names of people who owed money. Names of people who had problems. Names of people who suddenly stopped being names. A system of accountability in a world without courts. The first ledger found by investigators years earlier, during a raid in a remote mountain region, shocked everyone who saw it. Pages yellowed from humidity. Edges torn. Ink faded in places. But the structure was unmistakable. Columns of initials. Dates. Amounts. A symbol at the end of many lines, sometimes a check mark, sometimes a circle, sometimes an X. The check mark meant the task was completed. The circle meant the task was pending. The X meant the person tied to that entry was no longer alive. To the organization, it was bookkeeping. To the families of the missing, it was horror in ink. And as the internal war worsened, more ledgers surfaced, some seized during operations, others abandoned in safe houses, others retrieved by journalists risking their lives to expose the truth. Each one revealed the same pattern. The empire was not held together by guns alone. It was held together by records, by lists, by an invisible bureaucracy more rigid than many governments. The ledger was the spine of the organization. And as the factions fought, the ledger itself became a weapon. Because when leadership is questioned, when loyalties fracture, when fear spreads, the ledger becomes the ultimate tool of control. Both sides used it. The old guard updated their lists, marking who remained loyal, who straddled the line, who might be leaking information to the young faction. The young faction created their own, names of those who needed to disappear for their new regime to take shape. In some regions, entire families found themselves recorded, not because they did anything, but because someone else believed they might. This was the darkest truth of the ledger. It didn't need evidence. It only needed suspicion. One investigator described it as a death sentence in pencil. Once your name was written, all that remained was for someone to darken the line. The organization used codes for regions, safe houses, and shipments. Z13 for a warehouse. R7 for a route through the mountains. B5 for a border city. Symbols for payment cycles. Dashes for debts. Arrows for collections. But the most haunting entries were the ones without symbols, just a name, a date, and a blank space. Those were the names yet to be decided. Lives hanging in limbo. One ledger recovered near a border corridor contained over 200 entries across several months. Next to one line was a chilling note. Pending. Ask commanders. The man listed their vanished days later. His family searched for years. They never found him. During the internal war, as the factions clashed, their ledgers began to diverge, each one reflecting a different version of reality. One list named a certain lieutenant as loyal. Another ledger listed him as a target. Days later, he was dead. The contradictions became a map of paranoia. Old allies appeared on elimination lists. New recruits were promoted in the margins. Entire towns were marked with symbols indicating risk, opportunity, or betrayal. And sometimes, the ledgers exposed corruption so deep it shook entire institutions. One notebook, seized during an operation near a northern highway, contained payments to local officials, itemized month by month. Next to each name was a short description. Road clearance. Tip-offs. Radio silence. Avoidance. The clarity was shocking. The organization didn't just bribe, they accounted. They didn't just command, they documented. They didn't just rule, they recorded their rule. And in some cases, those records were the only surviving evidence of disappearances no one else dared investigate. Families begged for answers. Officials shrugged. But the ledger knew. The ledger always knew. During the internal war, the young faction weaponized the ledger in a new way, using it to identify every official, every businessman, every operator who had ever supported the old guard. Their lists grew. Names multiplied. Entire communities found themselves walking on eggshells. Rumors spread like wildfire. If your name is in the book, pray. If you hear your initials whispered, run. People fled towns overnight. Others begged local leaders to vouch for them. Some offered money, property, anything to get their names erased. But erasing was rare. The pencil wrote fast. The eraser moved slowly. And then came the ledger that changed everything. Recovered during a raid that the government never publicly disclosed, this particular book contains something unusual, not just payments, not just targets, not just codes, but ties to high-ranking officials whose influence stretched far beyond local power. Names that appeared in public life, politicians, business leaders, public security figures. Amounts so large they seemed impossible. Dates that aligned with major decisions, suspicious delays, strategic withdrawals of law enforcement. For investigators, it was explosive. For the organization, it was catastrophic. For the factions, it was ammunition. The young faction claimed it proved the old guard was compromised. The old guard claimed it was fabricated. But both sides knew one thing. If the ledger reached the wrong hands, their world could collapse from within. So they hunted it. Not with soldiers. Not with convoys. But with silence. Interrogations behind closed doors. Threats delivered in whispers. Entire communities locked down as they searched for the source of the leak. The ledger did not just contain names. It contained truths that neither faction could fully control, truths that threatened the delicate balance of power that the organization had maintained for decades. And as the factions fought over that truth, something began to crumble. The internal war was no longer about corridors or cities. It was about survival. Survival of leaders. Survival of cells. Survival of the very structure the organization depended on. And as the ledger passed through hands, law enforcement, journalists, rival factions, each person who touched it understood the same thing. This was more than a record. It was the blueprint of an empire. And empires built on secrets eventually choke on them. The internal war, fueled by betrayal, greed, and ambition, was reaching a point of no return. And as both sides scrambled to control the narrative, protect their alliances, and erase their vulnerabilities, a new threat emerged. One that neither ledger, neither faction, neither leader had planned for. A threat from the outside. A pressure so immense it would force both sides to react in ways that would push the conflict into an entirely new chapter of violence. The empire was bending. And soon, it would break. The empire was bending. And soon, it would break. Pressure had been mounting for years, pressure from rivals, pressure from within, pressure from government forces. But now, a new weight pressed down, heavier than anything the organization had endured before. Not a bullet. Not a betrayal. But something far more disruptive. Global attention. Because once the ledgers surfaced, once investigators uncovered the depth of corruption and the scale of influence stretching far beyond the mountains, an international spotlight swung onto the organization with blinding intensity. Foreign agencies increased surveillance. Joint task forces doubled their operations. Extradition requests multiplied. Border security tightened. Helicopters, drones, and intelligence analysts worked day and night. Every corridor, every safe house, every routine operation became a risk. And then, the arrests began. Not the low-level detentions that had filled headlines for years. Not the occasional seizure meant to show progress. These were targeted strikes, surgical, coordinated, devastating. In mountain hideouts, in urban apartments, in remote ranches, in seaside towns, figures who had once seemed untouchable were captured one by one. Some arrests came from raids launched after months of intelligence collection. Others were the result of betrayals, information sold for freedom, offered for revenge, or exchanged for survival in a war that devoured its own sons. One of the first major captures sent shockwaves through the ranks. A high-ranking regional operator, someone who had controlled a critical corridor for nearly 2 decades, was cornered in a small village. Authorities closed in as locals watched from behind shuttered windows. He surrendered without a fight. It was the silence of his surrender that terrified everyone. Because silence meant fear. Silence meant pressure. Silence meant he might talk. His arrest triggered panic across the organization. Phones were destroyed. Safes emptied. Safe houses abandoned. Accounts frozen. Allies questioned. Names erased from ledgers. The old guard blamed the young faction. The young faction accused the old guard. Both factions sensed something worse. The government wasn't acting blindly anymore. Someone was providing details only insiders could know. And the pressure did not stop. More arrests followed: mid-level operators, logistics managers, accountants, smugglers, pilots. One by one, the invisible infrastructure began to crumble. And when the walls of an empire begin to crumble, the foundation becomes exposed. That foundation was leadership. For years, top figures had maneuvered through a labyrinth of alliances, political protections, and hidden networks. They survived raids, escaped capture, negotiated truces, outsmarted rivals, and built a legacy that spanned continents. But the new era was different. Technology changed. Intelligence methods evolved. International cooperation strengthened. And the internal fracture weakened the organization's shield. Eventually, the moment arrived, the moment the world had been waiting for, the moment the organization had feared, the moment that symbolized the beginning of the empire's collapse. The capture of a kingpin. It didn't come with explosions or dramatic shootouts. It came through patience, strategy, and relentless pressure. For months, investigators tracked signals, followed couriers, monitored safe houses, analyzed movements. And when the operation began, it unfolded with lethal precision. Helicopters thundered overhead. Marines breached walls. Commanders shouted orders. Gunfire erupted in bursts. And then, silence. A high-profile figure was in custody. For the world, it was a victory. For authorities, it was proof of progress. For communities living under fear, it was a single moment of hope. But inside the organization, it was a wound that would never heal. Because when a leader falls, the system built around him fractures. And fractured systems bleed. The young faction claimed the arrest as an opportunity, proof that the old guard was losing its grip. The old guard claimed betrayal, insisting the young faction had provided information to weaken them. Each side pointed fingers. Each side built narratives. Each side demanded loyalty. And while the factions argued, the government tightened its grip. Arrests continued. Raids intensified. Extraditions became routine. Key figures were flown across borders in chains, faces hidden beneath helmets, wrists shackled, futures sealed by foreign courts. These extradited figures represented decades of knowledge, names, routes, alliances, weaknesses. And no matter how loyal they had once been, not everyone could withstand the pressure of life imprisonment far from home, far from their networks, far from the world they once ruled. Some stayed silent. Others spoke. Truths spilled out, partial, selective, strategic. Every word added strain to an already collapsing structure. And yet, amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. The organization survived. Not intact. Not unscathed. But alive. Because empires built on money, geography, and desperation do not collapse overnight. They bend, they break, they adapt. New leaders emerged from the shadows, some ambitious, some cautious, some violent. The young faction, emboldened by the old guard's vulnerability, seized corridors abandoned in the wake of arrests. The old guard, even while wounded, maintained powerful alliances, deep community ties, and a wealth of knowledge that younger operatives couldn't replicate overnight. The internal war, once fought with bullets and betrayals, now shifted into a quieter but far more dangerous phase. A political war, fought through influence, negotiations, bribes, and silent decisions made in dark rooms. Some cities saw temporary lulls in violence as leadership stabilized. Others exploded in conflict as factions clashed over who would replace those taken away. Government forces mistook these shifts for success, believing their operations had finally broken the backbone of the organization. But what they didn't understand was that every arrest, every extradition, every takedown created a vacuum. And vacuums in this world are filled immediately. The younger faction capitalized on every opening. They reorganized. They absorbed smaller cells. They expanded their reach. But with expansion came arrogance. And with arrogance came mistakes. Their methods, loud, reckless, brutal, caught the attention of authorities quickly. Communities grew terrified of their unpredictability. Rivals united against them. Even some of their own allies recoiled from the chaos they unleashed. Meanwhile, the remnants of the old guard evolved. They moved silently. They rebuilt networks. They strengthened financial operations. They leveraged years of goodwill in certain communities, gaining information that became invaluable in the next phase of the war. Because while the world focused on the arrests, the real battle was brewing in the shadows. A battle for inheritance. A battle for identity. A battle for the soul of the organization. And as both factions maneuvered to claim leadership, another storm brewed on the horizon. One driven not by leaders or soldiers, but by the human cost of decades of violence. A cost measured not in money or territory, but in graves. Because as the empire cracked, more and more people were caught in the crossfire, families, journalists, local officials, entire communities abandoned by systems meant to protect them. And these voices, these victims, became something the organization could no longer ignore. The empire's collapse was not only political. It was human. And its consequences would echo through. The empire's collapse was not only political. It was human. And its consequences would echo through the next chapter. Because behind the arrests, the raids, the shifting alliances, lay the people who never had a say in any of it. The civilians. The families. The quiet, forgotten witnesses of a war they were forced to live through. Decades of conflict carved deep wounds across Mexico, wounds measured not in territory or money, but in empty chairs at dinner tables, unmarked graves in the desert, and faces printed on posters taped to lampposts. Missing. Please help us find him. Disappeared since last Tuesday. Entire regions became ghostly reminders of violence. Once thriving towns emptied overnight. Families fled with nothing but a backpack in the hope that somewhere, somehow, safety existed beyond the next roadblock. In some valleys, silence became the sound of absence. No children playing. No doors opening. Just wind brushing across abandoned houses that once held laughter. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of people disappeared over the years, a number so large it became almost impossible to comprehend. Mothers formed search brigades, digging through dry riverbeds and fields with nothing but shovels, gloves, and photographs pressed to their chests. One mother said, "I don't look for justice. I only look for bones." Her words cut deeper than gunfire ever could. Journalists paid an unthinkable price. Trying to tell the truth in regions where truth itself was dangerous meant risking their lives with every story. Some were silenced forever, abducted, murdered, or threatened into fleeing their homes. Entire newsrooms shut down because the cost of reporting became higher than the cost of staying silent. Teachers kept classrooms open in cities where gunfire echoed through hallways. They taught multiplication and spelling while helicopters circled overhead, while children learned to hide under desks faster than they could recite the alphabet. Doctors treated the wounded knowing some injuries were too dangerous to report, too politically loaded to file properly, too tied to forces no hospital dared mention in official records. Even local officials, mayors, police chiefs, council members, walked with a target on their backs. Some made deals to survive. Others refused, and died for it. In border cities, violence reshaped the rhythm of life. People checked the sky for helicopters before leaving home. They avoided certain streets, certain hours, certain neighborhoods that were owned by one faction or another. Parents kept children indoors at dusk. Businesses locked their doors early. And every night, the same prayer lingered. Let tomorrow be quiet. But the quiet rarely came. The internal war, the territorial battles, the arrests, they each left remnants of trauma scattered across the country like broken glass. No region was untouched. No community unaffected. In the mountains, elders spoke of how the conflict had changed the land itself, how trails once used for farming became routes of fear, how gathering firewood became a risk, how the sight of a pickup truck on a dirt road could send an entire village into hiding. Along the coasts, fishermen described nights when no one dared launch their boats, terrified of being mistaken for informants or rivals. Livelihoods vanished. Generations of tradition disappeared into the tide. And yet, amid all this devastation, something else emerged. A resilience that refused to die. Families created networks to search for the missing. Journalists built collectives to protect one another and keep stories alive. Communities formed self-defense groups, sometimes armed with nothing more than radios and determination, to reclaim their neighborhoods. Human rights organizations documented every disappearance, every grave site, every injustice the official records ignored. Courage became its own form of resistance. Memory became a shield. Truth became a quiet rebellion. Because to forget would mean letting the violence win completely. One priest in a border town said, "We bury the dead, but we also bury their fear inside us. And somehow, we keep going." The human cost of the empire's rise, and its fractured fall, was measured not just in bodies, but in broken childhoods, fractured communities, lost futures, and the silence left behind by those who never came home. And as the internal war raged, as factions fought for dominance, as governments pushed for control, the people remained trapped in a conflict not of their making. But soon, something would happen. Something that would force everyone, even the deepest players inside the organization, to confront the reality that no empire can rise forever. And no war burns without devouring its own foundations. The question now was not who held power, but what remained of that power when the dust finally settled. And what kind of empire could rise from the ashes? The question now was not who held power, but what remained of that power when the dust finally settled. And what kind of empire could rise from the ashes? Because no matter how deeply rooted an organization seems, no empire survives unchanged. Not after this much blood. Not after this much betrayal. Not after losing the very leaders who once held its universe together. The internal war had dragged on far longer than anyone expected. The arrests, the extraditions, the raids, each one carved pieces out of the structure until the once mighty body began to wither. But it didn't collapse completely. Instead, it split. Multiple factions emerged from the same origin, each claiming lineage, each claiming legitimacy, each claiming the right to rule what remained. Some factions followed the old guard, believing in discipline, negotiation, and long-term strategy. Others rallied behind the younger generation, more aggressive, more reckless, unwilling to accept the old rules. And in the shadows, smaller cells broke away entirely, seeking independence in regions long contested by larger players. The organization that once held a unified identity now looked like shattered glass, dozens of sharp edges, each reflecting a different future. In the mountains, old strongholds still carried the weight of history. Veteran operators maintained control through local loyalty, community ties, and a quieter kind of authority, one built over decades, not years. Their influence didn't depend on loud displays of force. It lived in relationships, favors, and debts that stretched back generations. But in the cities, a different energy pulsed. Younger commanders seized the absence of top leadership to stake claims of their own. Their rise was fueled by ambition and impatience, men shaped by years of war, who saw opportunity in the chaos. They didn't want tradition. They wanted dominance. And their methods reflected that hunger. Rapid takeovers. Aggressive recruitment. Militarized tactics. Visible control of neighborhoods that had long feared any shift in power. These younger factions believed the future belonged to those who acted first, struck hardest, and refused to negotiate. They saw the old guard as relics, too cautious, too slow, too bound by unwritten codes. Meanwhile, the old guard saw the younger generation as a threat not only to the organization, but to stability itself. And in the middle of these two poles were the civilians, again. Caught in a new wave of uncertainty. Unsure who controlled what. Unsure which faction's rules now applied. Unsure whether the next gunfight would be between rivals or the same group fighting itself, again. Regions shifted loyalties weekly. One day a town belonged to the old guard. The next, the younger faction arrived and claimed it. By the following week, a splinter cell contested the same streets. The map of influence changed like sand in the wind. Authorities struggled to understand this new landscape. The group they once targeted as a single entity had transformed into multiple organisms, each requiring different strategies, different intelligence, different pressure points. Foreign agencies were forced to reassess their operations. What once was a linear hierarchy had now become a constellation of leaders, regional bosses, and autonomous cells, some coordinated, some barely connected, some operating purely for survival. And yet, despite the fragmentation, one truth remained. The brand still carried weight. The name, whispered across borders, still meant something: fear, power, history, and the memory of a structure that once dominated the entire landscape. Some factions fought to preserve that legacy. Others fought to redefine it. A few wanted to erase it entirely and build something new from the ruins. This struggle for identity became the next battleground. Not a war of bullets, but a war of ideology, vision, and survival. Who are we now? Who leads us? What does the future look like? What rules still matter in a world where every rule has been broken? These questions tore through the ranks as much as any gunfire. In private meetings held in mountain cabins, veterans argued over strategy, whether to attempt reunification or accept permanent fragmentation. In city-safe houses, younger leaders debated expansion, alliances, or full-scale confrontation against rivals and even against each other. In border towns, mid-level operators weighed the benefits of independence versus allegiance. Everyone sensed the same thing. The next era would not look like the last. Not after the arrests. Not after the ledgers. Not after the betrayals. Not after the internal war that devoured its own architects. The empire's fractures were permanent. The factions born from it were too different, too entrenched, too shaped by divergent philosophies to ever merge seamlessly again. But fragmentation did not mean disappearance. It meant evolution. The organization, once a single, towering force, was transforming into a network of competing heirs, each carrying a piece of the old legacy and a vision of a new, uncertain future. Some would rise. Some would fall. Some would fade quietly. But all of them would reshape the landscape in their own image. Because power never disappears. It simply changes hands. And in the cracks of a collapsing empire, new powers always emerge. The empire was broken. But the war for what remained was only beginning. Every empire ends. Some collapse overnight. Others crumble slowly, piece by piece, under the weight of the violence that built them. This one did both. It rose from fishermen and mountain trails. It grew through alliances, money, and fear. It survived wars, betrayals, arrests, extraditions, and fractures that would have shattered any lesser organization. And when it finally broke apart, the pieces didn't disappear, they scattered. Some became independent factions. Some dissolved. Some evolved into new identities. Some clung to the past, refusing to let an old legacy die. And some simply vanished into silence. But the truth is this. There is no single ending to the story of the Sinaloa organization. There are many. Each town has its own version. Each family holds its own scars. Each region carries its own memory of what the rise and fall of this empire meant. For some, it meant opportunity. For many, it meant fear. For countless others, it meant loss. The corridors still exist, changed, contested, fragmented, but present. The mountains still hear whispers of new alliances forming. The cities remain battlegrounds where shadows shift faster than the sun sets. Authorities continue their hunt. Rivals continue their expansion. And civilians continue trying to live between forces far larger than themselves. No arrest ended this world. No single leader controlled it. No ledger captured all its secrets. This was never a story of one man. Or one faction. Or one war. It was the story of an ecosystem built on power, geography, poverty, corruption, and survival. An ecosystem that reshaped a nation, and, in many ways, reshaped the world. Even today, whispers of the old empire remain. Some factions still claim its legacy. Some reject it. Others manipulate it for their own rise. But the era we just explored, the rise from the mountains, the corridors of power, the internal betrayals, the ledgers of death, the fractures and the fall. That era is over. What remains is something different. Something scattered. Something unpredictable. Something far less centralized. But no less dangerous. And yet, amid all the stories of violence and ambition, one truth outlives them all. It is the people. The families. The forgotten. The searching. The grieving. That carry the real weight of this history. They are the ones who deserve remembrance. Not the leaders. Not the factions. Not the territories or the money. But the lives forever altered by the empire's rise, and its ruin. In the end, the Sinaloa Cartel's story is not just a chronicle of crime. It is a mirror reflecting the forces that birthed it. Forces still at play today. And as long as those forces remain, the echoes of this empire will continue to shape the landscape it once ruled. But this chapter, the chapter of its rise, its reign, its fractures, and its unraveling, comes to a close here. An empire built on bodies, power, and blood, now reduced to ashes scattered across the deserts, mountains, and cities where it once ruled uncontested. This is where the story ends. And where the next one, whatever form it takes, silently begins.